Thank you for joining Marianne and the professor. I am delighted to be joined by Dr. David Bell. David, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks.
So David, I had not heard of you before until I read a brilliant article of yours called "Why Legislators Should Reject the WHO's Proposal for Pandemic." And it was written up in the Brownstone. It was a brilliant article, and I contacted you right away to say, who are you and tell me more? Thank you, first of all, for that tremendous article.
It was actually co-written with Van Dien, who's a lawyer who used to work in the UN as well. So.
Okay, so it was a collaboration. So introduce yourself, Dr. David Bell, because I think people would be very interested in hearing about who you are and your background.
Okay, yeah, I'm a public health physician currently in the US. From Australia originally. I have a PhD in population health, worked in infectious diseases, mostly particularly malaria in the World Health Organization, and on outbreaks, epidemics, etc., for about 7 or 8 years. Led some programs in the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics in Geneva, and worked in a Gates lab as a director of global health technologies in just outside of Seattle for a few years. So now I consult in global health and biotech area.
So you are as close to the inside as we can get, I think, at this point, in terms of your history with the WHO, with the Gates Foundation, with global health, with biotech industry. It's a pretty weighty background that you have in terms of being able to weigh in on this topic of the WHO and the pandemic treaty and the IHR. So where do we start here? Maybe I should start with the WHO. What was the original intent of the WHO in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of people start things that have different opinions, but the original intent, I think, was good. It's there is a lot of inequality in the world regarding disease burdens and so on. There's a lot of inequality regarding finance, which is related, and there are such things as outbreaks across borders, and coordination is useful. So it was started at the end of what we thought was the end of fascism after the Second World War and all that went with that, particularly that, and there was a big public health push for fascism as well, which is worth remembering, as the health field led there in instituting those measures, the evils that happened. And there was an era of decolonization, countries becoming independent, getting out of the yoke of imperialists. So WHO was, it was set up as a one country, one vote sort of organization that would help the countries in the world on request to help with technical expertise, with helping to coordinate somewhere to meet, to discuss diseases across borders, and particularly to address the very high burden diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, diseases of malnutrition, etc. So it was a good idea, and it was set up on a pretty good basis that countries will give according to their GDP, so according to their wealth, and WHO would look at the greatest disease burdens and apply most of that money based on that basis. So that it sort of continued. We had the Alma-Ata Declaration in the 70s and so on, sort of the epitome of this, the idea that the WHO was sort of based on, which was that countries and communities would be in charge of healthcare, and that was the best way to run it. And community health workers, access to them, we know, is that in low-income countries, it's one of the biggest determinants of health. So trying to get that sorted, and it sort of continued that way. But when I joined in 2002, I think it was just starting to change, and a lot of it was the idea of public-private partnerships, which seen to be a good idea at the time because they bring more money in, and money helps with getting rid of diseases. But it also brought the private bit, which is part of the private-public partnership. And private individuals and private corporations, they join things like that for a reason. And the reason is because, for a corporation, they have to benefit their shareholders. That's what their job is. So they will join if they think that they can do something which will benefit the shareholders. If you're a pharma company, you want to sell lots of product to benefit your shareholders, then you start some public-private partnerships with someone like the World Health Organization and push your vaccines or push the idea of mass vaccination, for instance. So, and then there are individuals, prominent individuals who put in funding as well. And sometimes I think sometimes that is for a good intent, but the problem is that suddenly, rather than having relatively unbiased, hopefully technical experts from all these countries deciding where the focus is, you have the individual who gives the money, who comes from one particular country, probably a wealthy background, etc., deciding where the money goes. So suddenly, public health, global health became sort of the domain of the rich and under the control of the rich and large corporations, rather than the member states, which it was originally set up as. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think the WHO started off on good. It was a good idea. I think for most of its history, it's been a net benefit to humankind. I think for the last 3 years, it hasn't. It's probably been to me, it's probably been a negative. It doesn't mean it doesn't still do some good stuff in a lot of areas, but the enormity of what's happened over the last 3 years, which the WHO has been one of the major pushers of, I think has undone a lot of the good that has been done in the past.
So before we get into the WHO's role in COVID, I want to talk in your article in the Brownstone, you mentioned the big killers of humanity. And I think the WHO, my sense is the WHO used to be very concerned about those big killers. Can you expand on that? Because I found that to be rather intriguing.
Yeah, and the WHO would say they still are, but if you look at where the resources go and where the emphasis of their messaging is, that it's not the case. So tuberculosis kills over 1.5 million people every year. The outbreaks, like the flu outbreaks in 1950, 1960, that the WHO calls pandemics, they killed just 1 million people each. So, so tuberculosis every year is worse than those. And, COVID, it's hard to know how many people COVID actually killed and how many people died through the lockdowns and through the poor management, where, elderly people with respiratory disease were stuck on ventilators or just left alone in a bed, barrier nursed without any chest physio and without being able to walk around, which is what you're supposed to do with an old person with respiratory disease, as we all know. So, and then, there's other issues with the figures with COVID, from COVID, etc. So probably COVID has killed, I don't know, similar perhaps to what TB kills each year, but maybe a bit more, but much older people. So if you look at life years lost, the actual burden that WHO used to use up to 2020 to assess disease burdens, even COVID has never rivaled tuberculosis or malaria, which kills mostly under 5-year-olds. Every time a 5-year-old dies, they lose 70 years of life, 75 years. If an average person dies from COVID, they probably lose 1 or 2 years. So in terms of the disease burdens that WHO was interested in, COVID doesn't rate, especially in low middle income countries where most of humanity lives.
So
it's their main focus at the moment.
It's their main. So the big killers of humanity, it sounded like, they're not infectious diseases. It's heart disease, it's strokes, it's cancer.
Yes, exactly. I was talking
diabetes.
Yes, indeed.
So if you're looking at the
insulin resistant syndromes.
insulin resistance. So when you compare the non-infectious diseases, are those not the diseases that the WHO should be focused on?
Yeah, so they should be focused on them and the major infectious ones. And malnutrition, which underlies a lot of this, obviously. Malnutrition is not just not having enough food, it's not having enough certain micronutrients, etc. So, the non-communicable diseases are particularly concentrated in wealthy countries that should be able to manage their own health. So WHO should be interested, but I'm not sure it should be their main focus. Why does the WHO need to intervene in the health of the United States, for instance, or Europe? Beyond, helping to name some diseases, and that's about it. So because those countries have more than enough resources to manage themselves. So if you look at where there's a lack of resources for historical reasons, then it's non-communicable diseases are increasing, but these are readily preventable infectious diseases are also a high burden.
So really, in your mind, the perfect WHO would be focused on what? Malnutrition, malaria. If you were at the head of the WHO, what would you be focused on?
Well, I would be focused on diseases of low income and malnutrition, etc. Also on, and to manage those, you would look at strengthening primary health care, strengthening access to basic medicines, basic services. And you would do that in a way that it is through countries and driven by communities, so that, because, that is what sustainability is. Sustainability is not some rich people in a Western country making a commodity and then sending it to, people in a village somewhere. It's giving them the resources to improve their economics, improve their health, improve their living conditions and so on, so that they don't need that.
Right.
And if you look at in Western countries, it is not vaccines that increased our life expectancy. Vaccines helped a tiny bit in the last few decades. The antibiotics helped quite a bit before that, but by far the biggest influence, and this isn't controversial, is improved living conditions, improved nutrition, and so on. So improved sanitation. So that is where you get the biggest bang for the buck. That's where you can make the biggest improvements in health.
So it sounds quite clear that you want to be, the WHO should be focusing on improving living conditions, sanitation, good water supply. It should be a decentralized model, giving authority to the local governments. And it sounds as though a major consideration is life years lost. And I'm glad you brought that up, because you're right. The average age of death in COVID is 82. And you say the average age of death of malaria is 5 years.
Under 5.
Yeah, under 5. So they're not comparable. And the life years lost, it seems to be lost in the current WHO. They're not considering this at all.
And if it was decentralized, and you asked a grandmother in Burkina Faso, do you want a COVID vaccine, or do you want your grandchild to be protected from malaria? I suspect most of them would say, please protect my grandchild first.
Yeah. How many people die? How many people die of malaria every year in the world?
So it's about 650,000. It's increased during the pandemic, or during the COVID event, by about 85,000 a year. So according to the WHO's figures. So that's since the start of the COVID event, we have probably added about 250,000 dead children to what we would have otherwise had from malaria. But that's just malaria. Tuberculosis is going up, HIV, all these things are going up because when you stop supply lines, you stop clinic access, etc. You increase poverty, then we know these go up. That's what's happened.
Okay, now let's jump into the WHO's role in the COVID crisis. Tell me about what you perceive their response to be and the fallout from that.
Yeah, so it hasn't come out of the blue. So there's been an increasing push with these public-private partnerships and the way that WHO funding has changed. It's now, now most of the funding is specified, which means it's over 80%, which means the private donor or the country says, oh, we'll give you this money to do this particular project in this place, even with these people, etc. So the WHO has become a tool of other interests rather than an independent agency. And that's the major problem. So those other interests, particularly pharmaceutical companies and investors in the pharmaceutical area, because the WHO is an obvious target, because if you can mandate vaccines for the whole world, you're just printing money. And if you can manage the regulatory side of that as well, so that they don't look too hard at potential harms, etc., then the market is yours. And that's really what's happened over COVID. And so alongside the WHO, we've seen the growth of Gavi, which is just focused on vaccine delivery, which, on its own, not all vaccines are bad. So on its own, it's like public-private partnerships. It seems a good idea until you realize that it's totally skewing the resources for health away from the major burdens to a particular commodity. CEPI, which was started at the World Economic Forum in 2017, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, I think. It was started by private interests, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, plus Norway and India particularly, but it's solely focused on pandemics. So, historically, pandemics are really rare. Since the Spanish flu, WHO only records 3 before COVID, so in 100 years. As I mentioned, 2 of those killed just, far less than we lose from TB every year. The other one was swine flu, which killed less than flu normally kills. So pandemics are rare events. COVID, as you mentioned, killed average age 82 or so. Very low health burden as well. Yet we've now seen because of this sort of private interest coming into global health, by far the biggest focus now in global health is pandemics and pandemic preparedness, which, you can see where they're talking about now $10 billion extra every year just for pandemic preparedness. The total WHO budget is only $3.5 billion. So this is a massive skewing of resources to a rare event that has a low health burden. And COVID had a low health burden. If even if you believe there's, WHO says about 6.5, 7 million deaths from COVID. Many of them were with, there are more deaths that they list from the pandemic, but they're including lockdown deaths, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So if you include that and you take into account that nearly all over 75, 80 years of age, then this is a minor blip compared to what these other diseases, and particularly, as you mentioned, what in Western countries and increasingly in countries like India, diabetes and obesity, insulin-resistant syndromes, the harm that they wreak. So we're moving from health to essentially an industry, a pharmaceutical-driven industry,
Mm-hmm.
which is just a way of shifting money from taxpayers who ultimately fund a lot of this to the private companies who fund just enough to have control of the agenda.
So before I go into who the corporate sponsors are, who's funding the WHO, how can the WHO not be aware of Dr. John Ioannidis from Stanford and the infection fatality rate? He's been very public about that, saying the infection fatality rate of COVID is exactly the same as the seasonal flu. How can the WHO not have got that memo? If I know about it, why does the WHO not know about it?
No,
And
they
why are
do. Yeah, Ioannidis's first paper was on this area was published in the bulletin of the WHO. They do know this. The WHO ran a study in Africa where they showed pre-Omicron, so third quarter of 2021, they showed 66% over a very large area, multiple regions across Africa. 66% of people or so had were positive antibodies for COVID, for SARS-CoV-2, the virus. So they had, before Omicron, most people in Africa had been infected already. Then Omicron went through. So the WHO knows that virtually everyone in Africa has had the disease. They know the data, say, from CDC that show that post-infection immunity is as effective as vaccinating. Yet they are willing to spend, and they are spending billions of dollars still on vaccinating people in Africa, who half of whom are under 20 years of age and who the WHO knows already have immunity that is just as good as vaccine. So there's no public health priority driving this agenda. It's completely something else.
And what another mystery to me is ivermectin used to be considered one of the top 5 medications that the WHO considered to be essential medicine. Won a Nobel Prize 5 years ago. And all of a sudden you have massive data coming out from so many studies how effective ivermectin is in early treatment and hydroxychloroquine. And yet the WHO does not endorse it. In fact, in a lot of countries like mine, Canada, it became like contraband. What's that all about?
Yeah, it's interesting. And there are a lot of studies going in both directions, and you can easily design a study to say to make ivermectin not work. You would design a study like you would just have ivermectin on its own versus nothing, and you would give it after people started getting symptoms and quite sick. And then you will show that ivermectin has no significant difference. So there are quite a few studies that have done that and shown, as you'd expect, that it makes no significant difference. Most of the studies that claim to have shown impact have given ivermectin within a package of other, and we know, I mean, like vitamin D had the same almost denigration. Yeah, I mean, there's a paper in Nature now showing that potentially a third of deaths from COVID could have been saved if people had normal vitamin D levels. But this is obvious. This was, I mean, even any immunologist knows vitamin D is important for T cell function, which is the main way that we get rid of viruses. So, yeah, ivermectin's been donated 4 billion doses. Merck has donated 4 billion. Most of those to healthy people because it is so safe. You use it in mass treatment for diseases such as river blindness and sometimes lymphatic filariasis and so on. Where you're treating a whole population because a few of them have the disease. So you only do that with an extremely safe drug. So yeah, the strange thing about the whole ivermectin bit was that WHO they could have just been hands off, but they actually said it might be unsafe. Well, which is remarkable given that, I mean, there are studies now on using ivermectin for malaria because it also kills mosquitoes if they bite you after you've had ivermectin. You only do things like that because it's a community benefit, not a personal benefit. So, which is similar in a way to the other mass treatment. So you only do that with a very, very safe drug because you're not giving it to a sick person, you're giving it to a well person for the benefit of others. So there has to be extremely high safety bar to do that. So yeah, these are very safe drugs unless they're massively abused. Normally you would just be hands off, and repurposing drugs is supposed to be a priority because it's the best way often to get affordable medications to people who need them. If you put, the original remdesivir trial for the FDA did not show, it showed, I think, 2-day reduction in hospital stay, but no reduction in severity or overall outcomes. So, and we know it's hepatotoxic, liver toxic, etc., and has a number of other quite severe potential side effects. That seemed to go through and was, hospitals in the US were paid to use it. So yeah, there's not, There's a lot of things like this, and we've seen, they've managed to do this because and get away with it. You don't have to even accept that ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine work. You just have to accept they're very safe drugs. And there is in vitro data that shows they do have antiviral properties. So therefore, why not try them at scale? We haven't banned drugs like that before. We've normally you suggest to doctors, regulatory authorities will say, the label says you can use it for this and this. If you're using it off-label, you're in some risk. But you don't, strike doctors off for using drugs that are considered highly safe in a slightly unorthodox way. So this was a whole new approach to sort of controlling the way that medicines were used and controlling which medicines can be given and which cannot. So the WHO has always had essential medicines list, and they recommend medicines for certain diseases, but it's very unusual to denigrate safe medicines and say they should not be used or even tried. So.
Well, it seems odd. I mean, I've lived in Africa twice for a year and a half, and we were always advised by physicians to take ivermectin twice a week. It was considered very safe. Our children were taking it, and it was recommended at that point in time, take it once a week to kill parasites, and it has all sorts of fabulous effects. It's cheap. It was made by Merck or Glaxo way back, right?
Yeah,
Merck. So all of a sudden, it goes from being something that we took once a week to being dangerous and a horse dewormer. It makes no sense. And then I think of the big, well, it's not a study, but essentially how many million people in India, I can't remember the name of the region, that they decided millions and millions.
Uttar Pradesh.
Yes, okay. Tell me about, because that was fascinating, that COVID deaths almost disappeared once they started using that ivermectin. So obviously, that sounds like a pretty good study. What did you think of it?
Yeah, it did, and it's certainly it's a very strong association. Yeah, so it's very suggestive. And they gave a package that included ivermectin, I think vitamin D, and some other micronutrients and so on. So if you were suspected of having COVID, you took this package, and the government gave it out at very large scale. And COVID very rapidly disappeared from Uttar Pradesh, and very rapidly went down across India, except particularly in Tamil Nadu, which is a southern state which held out and were insisting on remdesivir rather than this package. It's extremely strong associative evidence, and certainly it had a big impact on mortality. So it wasn't a highly unsafe drug that was being given out. So, and it's not the only instance of that. There is a study, city in Brazil that had similar outcomes, etc. There are a lot of countries that use it. So, it's interesting. It sort of reflects the way we've looked at medicine now as well. So we have words like holistic and that sort of thing, and we're supposed to think they're good. But in practice, when we do a drug study, we do a randomized controlled trial, it's all good. But we do, we'll isolate a drug and we'll give that to a person. And then we'll compare that with nothing, rather than thinking, normally if you're going to manage a disease, particularly like an old person with complicated picture comorbidities, you would look at, their vitamin D levels, their zinc, you give them some zinc, you give them some stuff, and you might give them something with antiviral properties like ivermectin, but you give them a package, and you'd also give them chest physio, and you'd, etc. And these things are synergistic. So giving a single drug on its own often won't work, but giving a package of interventions probably does work, but we don't do randomized controlled trials on that. Which, we could have with COVID, because COVID was a great opportunity, because the standard management for old people with a positive COVID test was go home and come back if you're really short of breath. So we gave them nothing, which is really unusual treatment. But so there's an opportunity there. We could have given them a package of chest physio and everything else versus nothing. And there's no doubt, as the Nature paper on vitamin D showed, even vitamin D alone had a huge impact.
Yeah, well, Dr. Simon Godek Godek, I think it is, a Dutch fellow, has been a huge proponent of vitamin D. And his studies, he's really gone on a deep dive on that. And I would agree with him. Vitamin D has been a great way to ward off COVID, right?
Well, yeah, that's what the paper in Nature showed. That's what very early papers in 2020 in India showed. They showed people who died in India early on. I think it's 97, 98% were vitamin D deficient. And vitamin D deficiency is a big issue. So, and of course, someone can pull out a paper saying, yeah, if you give too much vitamin D, it becomes toxic. Of course, I mean, if you give
water is
ridiculous
toxic
doses
if you
of
drink.
yes, water is toxic
if you drink.
yes.
Yeah, so
but
it's ridiculous.
That's different than saying we will correct a vitamin D deficiency and ensure. And everyone in a nursing home anyway, like in aged care facilities and so on, this is a basic thing that you should be doing anyway because it's protective against all viruses, flu, COVID, everything else. So it's like trying to be fit. We closed the gyms and we didn't stress the reality that obesity is highly correlated with death from COVID. If people said that, they were told that they were fat shaming or something. So, there's a lot of things packed in here.
There's a lot, and I can't help but wonder, did the WHO not get the memo that vitamin D deficiency is one of the most significant, not predictors of death, but I'm not quite sure how to term it properly, but vitamin D is essential. And yet, did the WHO ever suggest that everyone hurry and get outside and get more vitamin D or start supplementing?
No, that they more sort of said stay indoors in the dark and don't see anyone.
It almost sounds like they're trying to. It almost sounds like they're trying to kill us. I mean, everything that is logical seems to have escaped the WHO, which is in theory was set up as an organization to improve quality of life around the world, and yet it seems as though they were grossly negligent.
I think negligence is fair. Yeah, I don't think anyone's, I don't think anyone's trying to kill anyone. I don't think anyone gets anything out of that. I think people are seeing making money is more important than almost anything else, and pleasing sponsors and who want to make money. And if you want a career in global health now, the best way to do it is to get on the pandemic preparedness bandwagon, because that's where all the there's more money than there's ever been in global health before. And as long as you toe the line, they're becoming a hugely lucrative area. It's going to become much, much more so. We're building a whole international bureaucracy around this. And so, the people in the WHO, like everyone else, most people, they'll find a way, people will find a way to turn a blind eye to any harm they or their organization might be doing if they can see a personal benefit accruing through that, in terms of salary and conditions. And
right.
And you can always say, that allows me to do a bit of good somewhere else, so I'm working in another disease, and they may be doing some good in that, but that probably doesn't counterbalance the harm that is being doing overall. So
maybe we should loop back and talk specifically about the corporate sponsorship, because the private-public partnership, or the public-private partnership between the WHO and certain corporations. Who are the biggest funders of the WHO? Can you list them? Who are the top 5? What countries or
top 5? I think companies? In this biennium, I think it's not necessarily in order, but it's the United States, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Germany, the European Commission, I think, and I think it's the United Kingdom.
Okay, so those are the power brokers in a sense. So, and tell me what you know about Tedros, who is the leader of the WHO. Tell me about this man, because I understand he has quite a sketchy history in Ethiopia. And he's not a physician, is that right?
He's not a physician. That doesn't necessarily discount him from being in the job.
Mhm.
If you look at what's happening in COVID, it's become very clear that I mean, most of managing, figuring out good public health, a lot of it's common sense. You don't have to be a physician, and the physicians have failed pretty widely. So yeah, he was the Minister of Health in Ethiopia under the previous regime there. Originally from Tigray, which is northern Ethiopia. So I mean, I wouldn't go into he's been accused of various things related to that government, but that's I'm no expert on that. He's I don't think the WHO is trying to take over the world. The WHO is a tool, and the people leading it, therefore, and the people high up also, to a large extent, I think, allowing themselves to be tools. But they don't sit around a table at the WHO and say, let's take over the world. We'll do the X, Y, Z. There are people using the WHO for this. So, the leadership of the WHO is, in the end, the country's vote. There's a lot of diplomacy beforehand. So the current leader had a lot of backing from China, for instance, who can mobilize a lot of countries through diplomatic means, finance, etc., to support. It's, in theory, it's a good thing that there is, and certainly an African, for a change, leading the WHO, Kofi Annan. Sorry, he was UN. But he's actually the first African leader, I think, of the WHO, which is strange because Africa is where was one of the large focuses of the WHO. So, I think focusing on the individual is not that useful because it sort of misleads us to think there is a person who is trying to do harm. We're dealing with tens of billions of dollars in finance moving. We're dealing with profits of hundreds of billions or trillions potentially coming from this to certain pockets. And so this is, the WHO is being used, as I think now the UN is being used, and other parts of, UNICEF is implementing the COVID vaccine in Africa. This is the Children's Fund. It's so you can figure out, where priorities are now. So we're dealing with something much bigger. We're dealing with a movement to really, I think, to go back to essentially a colonialist sort of model where you have large corporations and some governments working together to control the agenda for the rest of the world and for their own profit. And, there are, if you look at how the East India companies worked in the past for the Dutch and the British, it's a very similar sort of partnership between certain governments and large corporations. In those days, the corporations were sort of tied to a country. Now they're not, but they're tied generally to the West or to the EU or something, but not, they don't seem to respect national jurisdictions or be responsible within national boundaries. So I think this is part of it's an undermining of the idea that individual countries and individual people are sovereign and should be the drivers of their own lives versus things have become so unequal that there is a small group of people or in corporations at the top who have more money than whole countries, who can really buy the media, buy the WHO, buy the regulatory agencies, and buy these other international organizations, and can reshape the world to their benefit. And so, I mean, that is what we're seeing in WHO, and the whole pandemic preparedness is an important part of that. Because public health has always been a good way to, promote fascism and fascist tendencies. Yeah.
So in a sense, when you say that countries are losing their sovereignty, this is fascism, right?
Yeah, I think it's it's hard to put isms on it, but that to me, that's what best, it's the closest, historical movement for me to what's happening. Mussolini, and it's important to understand, people think fascism is far right. Fascism came from the left of politics. The Nazis were the National Socialist Workers' Party. Mussolini also came from the left. So, and he described sort of this corporate authoritarianism that was just one of his descriptions for what fascism is. He was the father of fascism. And that's very much what we're seeing. It's this melding of government or government bureaucracy. It's not government of the people, but it's the bureaucracies around governments with large private corporations for mutual benefit. Mm-hmm. Not of the country, but mutual benefit of that bureaucracy and the corporation. And I mean, that's clearly what has happened in COVID. It's a form of fascism. People are talking about Marxism and so on. I can't see that because there's nothing trying to be really egalitarian in any of this. This is all about a few people being able to control what everyone else does. And if we move to the pandemic preparedness treaties and the amendments that WHO is trying to put through at the moment, we say WHO is trying to do these treaties. In the end, countries are giving those amendments to WHO to put together to vote on. They are essentially taking the role in any health emergency, and health emergency is a huge, broad area. It's they're defining it as first as a threat and not actual harm. So if they decide it's a threat, and in the end they're saying the Director General, one person will decide what's a threat, then they can declare an emergency. And it can go beyond, it's not just pandemics for infectious diseases. The treaty mentions the One Health, which is being broadly defined now in global health circles as anything in the biosphere that affects human, not even disease, but human well-being, impinges on human well-being. So therefore, people are calling climate change, or they're saying, as they did in the US, racism is a public health emergency. If you can call anything a public health emergency, you can then say, therefore, we have to do the following measures. In an emergency, the government has to take over and tell you what to do for the greater good, rather than you deciding what's best in your context for your health based on your values, because this is an emergency. So this is what this is all about. It's beyond pandemics, but it's about the idea, and it's been very well demonstrated now in the US that you can do it, the idea of rule by emergency decree, so that you can do the things that you want, which will, essentially, as we saw in COVID, allow you to monetize the population. So, the biggest thing that came out of the COVID event was the largest shift in wealth we've ever seen from low-income people to high-income people. Which again, it's very weird that, for some weird reason, the sort of what we used to call the left side of politics, which seems to be now mostly rich people, but they're the ones that have supported this by and large, or at least it's the other side that seem to be pushing back. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing this massive infringement of what we thought were the basics of human rights, certainly in Western countries. This huge shift of wealth from low to high income people, and enhancement of large corporations over small business, etc., and independent business. So all the things that you would think were anti-left. So we've seen that in COVID, and now the pandemic preparedness agenda, without any sort of let's look back and see what worked and what didn't, is now trying to push this further. And the inevitable impoverishment that the COVID thing, the response brought, which was against WHO's, and this is where you can't just say this is WHO. WHO in 2019 put out the guidelines that said, do not don't close borders, don't quarantine healthy people, don't close businesses for more than 7 to 10 days, etc. They said that specifically in their flu pandemic guidelines. Never do that, they said. So 1 year later, they were doing it. So this is other forces pushing this agenda. And WHO is being compliant and going along. So they're culpable in that they're going along, but they're not the primary problem here.
So who is pushing this agenda in your mind?
I think the private part of the public-private partnerships. And so, the World Economic Forum is a club of those people. There are other clubs of those people, but if you look at who made the most money in the COVID response, that sort of tells you probably who is pushing this agenda.
And if you look at the strategic partners, there's 100 strategic partners of the World Economic Forum. And I recently looked at that list and I thought all of those companies did very well. The major consultancy firms, the oil and gas industries, the usual suspects were all listed there. And I thought, yes, they fared very well. So like you say, there's been a massive shift of wealth.
Yeah, and the people who aren't represented there, the small businesses, the ordinary people, and the small farmers, etc. So the majority of the world's population, but then they haven't got a voice to WHO. They can't fund, they fund WHO through their taxes, but that's filtered and directed by other people who are, in the bureaucracies of these countries who are in bed to a large extent with these corporations. But so it's their money, but they haven't got a voice. And that, is the epitomizer of change that we've seen in WHO. It's gone from supposedly trying to be the voice of those people to now essentially be, strategic partnerships with, the World Economic Forum. It's with large pharmaceutical companies, etc. That just doesn't fit with the ethos of decolonization and, getting rid of corporate authoritarianism and the excesses that the Nazis brought through that.
Well, and in your article, you talk about what a constitutional democracy is. And then we say, and then you point out the fact that the WHO does not answer to any population. So in a sense, it's like a rogue private organization that has authority without earning any.
It's interesting. It's an interesting position. So it's not private. It is in the end owned by all the countries. The World Health Assembly is one country, one vote, 194 countries. The country with 2,500 people has the same vote as a country with 1.4 billion. It's funny in that way, but so it is still officially an institution of the countries, but this is where it's difficult to explain this in a short time. So, but essentially the way the funding has worked, it's thousands of people. So the World Health Assembly is there. The people who go to the World Health Assembly are not, the average person off the street in a country. They're professional bureaucrats who spend their whole lives mixing, going to the same meetings, etc., as the large pharmaceutical companies, the regulatory agencies, etc. So it's part of the you can call it the public health industry, So that's who goes to the meetings, that's who writes the suggested amendments, etc. So officially there's a Ministry of Health there, but essentially it's a bureaucracy that's doing it. So you have that, and then you have the funding, which a lot of it comes through the countries, a lot of it now comes from these private corporate interests. And that's what the people in the WHO, that's what's paying their salaries. So, you know when you're working there where your salary comes from, which grant, which program, etc. And you know that, if it's a private interest, then you want to be refunded 2 years' time, or you might lose your job, your team will lose their jobs. You have very good healthcare benefits, very good pension, tax-free over a certain level. You don't pay tax within the WHO. Education benefits. Your priority working in the organization comes to please the people who are funding it. So it sort of works in two ways. You've got the direct influence on the people who are working there, and you've got the sort of the very cozy situation of the bureaucrats that represent the countries with the large pharmaceutical companies and the industry around there. So essentially that has shifted it from its original base.
Mm-hmm. So can you define the IHR? Because that is a term that pops up a lot.
Yeah.
And can you spell out the details?
Yeah, so it's international health regulations. Mm-hmm. Yeah, international health regulations. So they're decades old, but they were revamped after SARS-1 in 2005, the current ones. So they are supposed to deal with health emergencies across borders. And there are different levels within them. There are obligations of countries. All 194 countries of the WHO have signed on. So that they have force under international law. There are obligatory parts of those already that obligate country to, have a focal point, put certain resources into surveillance for health emergencies, etc., and to report, etc. And then there are recommendations under those, and it empowers the Director General to give recommendations for closing borders and mandatory medical examinations, mandatory vaccination, etc. What's happening at the moment is a series of amendments are being put forward. And these are essentially, they're moving the recommendations more to being obligatory. And they're strengthening the power of the Director General to make independent decisions. There's an emergency committee, but the amendments explicitly state he can ignore that. And he already can. He did with monkeypox, for instance, where he declared an international public health emergency of international concern on a disease that had killed at that stage 5 people in the whole world and was confined, 97 or 8% of cases to a very clearly defined demographic. So there was never a general public health emergency on monkeypox, but it was a good example of how an individual could declare that. So the amendments will make it, countries, when they sign them, as it's worded now, will undertake to follow his recommendations. So rather than recommendations, they become essentially obligatory. So he will be able to say, you should close these borders, you should mass vaccinate a population, quarantine, incarcerate essentially individuals. So yeah, this is obviously, people are saying, oh, it's not really an impingement on sovereignty. Of course it's an impingement on sovereignty. And there's no WHO police force, but there are teeth because the World Bank is behind this agenda, the IMF is behind this agenda very clearly, etc. The other large bureaucracies are behind this agenda. So they can force small, medium-sized countries to comply very easily if they decide not to.
So I just want to
the-
break in. So you said that the IMF and the World Bank are tied in, or the EU, they're all tied into this as well.
Yeah, the World Bank is funding pandemic preparedness already. They have a financial intermediary fund, FIF, that is aiming to put ostensibly $10 billion. They're suggesting additional a year as well. It's not that yet. Into pandemic preparedness. The G20 approved this at their meeting in Indonesia. So one thing this is all doing is building. So yeah, that there will be this power within the Director General, etc. But it's also building this bureaucracy, and that's what the treaty, which is the second thing at WHO, is doing. It's the funding, the governance, supply lines, etc., for what's happening with the international health regulations. And so it's building a huge surveillance bureaucracy that every country will have to be tested on every 2 years, that will surveil for viral variants, for instance, or any other health threats. And they will find them because they're essentially surveilling to see if nature is happening. And of course, nature will be happening. So, they don't have to show harm, they just have to show potential for harm, which is, any viral variant, some potential. So then they can, and they will declare potential or emergencies, because otherwise I have no reason for existence. It's, wholesale, you cannot go on like this without showing that you're needed by finding potential emergencies and then acting on them. So they will lock down populations, and then what will almost certainly happen is, and there's a 100-day vaccine initiative that you would be aware of with CEPI, where they want to get just 100 days to the vaccine instead of the accelerated COVID ones that we saw over 9 months or so. So they will then have a mass vaccination that they can mandate that will be there on the basis of this will save us from this threat. This will get you out of the lockdown that we just imposed on you. And therefore, $20 of vaccination or whatever, we will shift this $500 billion of your money to these pharmaceutical companies, and in the process, we will save humanity. And it's a really good model for printing money, or for appropriating wealth from the masses and putting it in the hands of a few. It's an excellent model. So that is what is trying to be built, and it's not trying to be flippant. Pandemics are rare unless we make them frequent, and they have a very low burden unless we make it high through the response. And that's what history tells us. So that's irrefutable. And there is not an increase, as the World Bank and others, WHO says, in human contact with wildlife that's putting us more at risk. There is less and less contact. Most humans hardly see animals now. They live in cities and maybe they have a dog and that's about it. But wildlife doesn't, if you're impinging on wildlife habitat, the wildlife doesn't move into human areas, it dies off. We have a crisis of declining biodiversity. That means there is less contact of wildlife with humans, not more. Mm-hmm. So people used to live very close to animals. They don't anymore, except in unusual circumstances. So this is built on falsehoods. It's not built on common sense or evidence or historical, reality. But it is vast amounts of money that people aren't really being aware of, and building in a bureaucracy that people are unaware of, which will then have to lock people down and save them with vaccines in order to justify its existence. So this is the real danger. This is what we're building in global health.
So in other words, a lockdown, they could suddenly mandate lockdowns are necessary because they have isolated and sequenced a new variant. And then they require vaccines that you mentioned are not even required to be tested. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. Yes, that's essentially right. You know, the COVID vaccines are a good example where they want to do them much faster in the future. The Therapeutic Drugs Administration, or Therapeutic Goods Administration, TGA in Australia, just released under Freedom of Information request, so not voluntarily, the Pfizer submission for back in February 2021 to get their license in Australia to push out the Pfizer COVID vaccine, mRNA vaccine. So they release the animal studies. They're really interesting. Firstly, there's a few things in the background. So the way that mRNA vaccines work is much more like a medicine, not like a vaccine. A traditional vaccine, you give an antigen, a protein or something. You have some adjuvants to help along, but you give a protein into a body. The body recognizes it as foreign and creates an immune response. It remembers that immune response. You are then immunized. Yeah, that's how a vaccine works. So the mRNA works by putting genetic material, mRNA, into your cells. They claimed just the cells in the arm, but I mean, logically that's not true, and we know it now. And I'll explain why it's not true. They put the mRNA into your cells. That uses the mechanism of your cells, the machine of your cells, to make the foreign protein, spike protein, which itself is a toxin. The cell expresses that on the surface. Your body recognizes that cell as foreign and dangerous and kills it, and creates inflammation, can kill some of the surrounding cells as well. So it acts as a medicine, not as a toxic medicine to cells, not as a traditional vaccine. But vaccines have a much lower bar of safety that they have to get through. We can argue about the reasons for that, but that's true. So in classing this as a vaccine, normally a genetic therapy, and Moderna use that term, genetic therapies, for their own medicines, for their own version internally. So it is a genetic therapy, it's genetic material used for therapy. So normally there's an even higher bar with, looking at genotoxicity, reproductive studies, etc., before any genetic medicine would be allowed on the market. Rather than doing that unusually heavy burden of safety demonstration for these new medicines, they said it was a vaccine and got to the lowest bar. And then they accelerated it further by having emergency authorization rather than a full authorization. So the TGA release, it shows something we already knew from a release in Japan through an FOI earlier in 2021, that rather than stay in the arm, a significant part of the mRNA, the lipid nanoparticles that carry it, so therefore we can be sure the mRNA goes around the body. It concentrates particularly in the ovaries, the liver, and the adrenal medulla, but it also goes to the brain and the spleen quite a lot, and the testes in men. So when it goes to the ovaries, what that means is it's going to the cells of the ovaries. Those cells will express the protein, the cells will be killed. If that's an ova, for instance, that I happen to go into, there's one less ova, you have a shorter reproductive period when you're a mature woman. Because you only have a certain number of ova, you produce them at birth, you don't grow more. So you're just losing them. Same with brain cells. So they knew, the TGA, all the regulatory authorities knew when they said it stays in the arm, they knew that was not true, that a significant part of it goes around the body and concentrates particularly in these organs. Then they did reproductive studies, and they did them on 44 rats. And they showed two things. One was that the vaccinated rats had twice the pre-implantation pregnancy loss rate of the control group. And that actually came out in 2021 as well. I remember Alex Berenson put that up, but I haven't been able to find the file, but he found it somewhere. But this was known to all the regulatory agencies then. And they got around this. So it was a case control study. And they got around it by ignoring the case control aspect and saying, we'll look back at other populations of these Wistar rats in other studies elsewhere in other places. And they got 25 studies or something. They showed that those rats in those studies had a slightly higher miscarriage rate, or some of them did, some of those populations did, a few of them. So therefore, even though they had double the rate of the control group, the vaccinated rats were still below what some Wistar rats had in other studies. So we'll say it's safe. And you know, it was a case control study. You compare the case with the control, it was double. So then they looked at fetal abnormalities, and there's 12 categories of fetal abnormalities they looked at in the rats that became pregnant in the fetuses. And in every single category, the vaccinated group had a higher rate of malformation than in the unvaccinated group. And there was only 2 categories out of those 12 where there was any malformations in the control group. And every category had malformations in all 12 in the vaccinated group. So that's, statistically, that's an enormously significant finding. Again, they said, okay, we'll look at a lot of other studies in the past at other places, and we'll look at what they found there with malformations. And they found that some of those studies had a higher rate of malformation. And therefore they said, we'll ignore the case control bit and we'll just say. So, I mean, these are huge red flags. A higher pregnancy loss rate, a higher malformation rate in fetuses. So normally you would then do animal studies, a lot more animals and a lot more species. And you would have to show that they, somehow those initial studies were wrong before you even considered giving it to humans, for women of childbearing age, let alone pregnant. And then you would really closely study in humans. But Pfizer, after having this data, they ran the trial in humans and they ignored the pregnancy outcomes. Something like it was 140 or 240 women became pregnant during the trial. They followed a few of them. Those few had a higher miscarriage rate than normal. But then they ignored the vast majority, never followed them up. And then the regulatory authorities and the public health authorities said on this data that this is safe in pregnancy. And we've all seen videos of prominent people denigrating women who say it's not safe and saying it's safe in pregnancy. And women lost their jobs for refusing to have this. So, if that can happen, then we have a huge problem with our health authorities. And it illustrates what I was saying, that we have essentially a capture of this whole, the industry has captured public health. Mm-hmm. And the industry is running public health for profit. And so, pharma has a long record, Vioxx with Merck, I think, and, Pfizer has paid the largest fraud payout in legal history only a decade or so ago, for lying about and misleading the public on their products. So these are the companies that even these companies, they showed in this data that there was a huge red flag around pregnancy and fetal abnormalities. Now, it doesn't mean in humans you will see the same thing. It means this is a huge red flag and you would never push it out in pregnant humans or women of childbearing age without being sure that this was an aberration. So rather than doing that, they just whitewashed it and said, they didn't, one suspects they didn't want to look, because statistically, it's pretty obvious what they're likely to find. So they just pushed this out. And, public health people went along with it, probably with reasons like, if we say it's dangerous in pregnancy, people have the wrong idea. And then some people that might be helped by the vaccine wouldn't be helped. And you can talk your way around these things. It's not legitimate, and it's denigrating the public as idiots. who have to be told what to do and can't be trusted to make a decent decision. But that's the history, unfortunately, of a large part of medicine. So, yeah, so, and this is what we're dealing with. This is what is driving this agenda. So yeah, it's a huge threat to not just to sovereignty and to human rights and so on, but to the health of people as well.
So it's fascinating when you say that the injection was classified as a vaccine as opposed to a gene therapy, which really is what it should have been classified as. But because they classified it as a vaccine, the safety and effectiveness is not scrutinized in the same way. Why is that?
Yes.
Like Robert Kennedy talks about this a lot. He says there are no vaccines that have been tested adequately, and yet they're rolled out on billions of people. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so firstly, I don't care if it's called a gene therapy or a vaccine. It depends on your definition of vaccine. If you redefine vaccine, which was done, as something that creates something that eventually stimulates an immune response against something, then fine, they're vaccines, doesn't matter. Yeah. What matters is it safe? Have you shown that it is safe before you give it to people? And is there a clear benefit over risk? And that should be the same with any vaccine, with any medicine. So it doesn't make sense to me personally to say vaccines should have a lower bar. I mean, anything you're giving to people should have, I would say you should probably almost never mandate things, or never. And that's something that, I've changed in my mind over the last 3 years, I think, because I've seen how it can be abused. But whatever you're going to give to people, you have to be absolutely transparent in the data. I mean, you can give this to pregnant women if you first say, these are the animal studies, these are the pregnancy loss studies. We have no better data. So, logically, this is a big risk. Well, actually, I mean, I don't know. And then it comes, if you then gave it, actually, you can argue, the woman has a right to take it, have it, but is a person giving the injection actually, knowingly doing harm? And should you do harm even if someone asks for it? That's a difficult one. Probably not. So, but that's essentially, I mean, it's been an interesting 3 years. So I've looked at vaccine safety as well. I've been very surprised, as I'm sure a lot of my colleagues have, at the tiny numbers of people that were in some vaccine trials. And not all. There are still vaccines out there that have trials of thousands and thousands of people and pretty good safety data. And I've seen children die of tetanus. I've seen someone die of rabies, or dying of rabies. They're not nice ways to go. I think the vaccines for those diseases are remarkably effective and a huge benefit to mankind. That has nothing to do with some other vaccine that hasn't been tested properly, and is for a disease that the person receiving it is highly unlikely to get or to be harmed by. Mm-hmm. So, it doesn't matter if it's a vaccine or a medicine or whatever. What matters is the benefit absolutely clearly outweighing the risk, and is the person receiving it fully informed on both those risks and benefits?
Well, were there any COVID vaccines that you felt were as safe or effective, or were they all equally bad?
I don't know. I think the data is so poor, which is remarkable, really, but also reflects perhaps the fact, most studies now are funded by the people who make the medicines, like most large studies. So we're stuck with that. So there's not very good data, I don't think. I don't discount the fact that some people may benefit, if they haven't had COVID yet. Very few people now, and they're in a very high risk category. We don't know, because the trials didn't include many people in the high risk categories. But if they had, maybe we would have seen a benefit.
Well, how about having those people just take lots of vitamin D and have them have easy access?
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
yes. So when you're saying a
Mhm.
high risk category, that has to be a high risk category that is well managed by other means as well. So, COVID did kill people, but whether the mortality, which is very clear from the vaccine, is less than the mortality that might have been averted by the vaccine, that's what matters, and in what age groups, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely clear in children and young, healthy adults that, I mean, it has been since 2021 that hospitalization and death from the vaccine is probably much higher than COVID.
Yeah.
But for people, these 82-year-olds who are at high risk, who have metabolic diseases, diabetes, etc., we don't know because no one's done the studies.
Well, I've had friends who manage care homes, and they say after the vaccine rollouts, they had record deaths. There seemed to be, now it's anecdotal, but vulnerable people seem to respond very negatively.
It's interesting. We saw that association across a lot of countries as well, particularly in Southeast Asia. So Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. The very low mortalities until mass vaccination started. Yeah. In India as well, and then mortality went up with the vaccine. I mean, there are probably a lot of factors involved there, and it could even be people. Yeah, it's complicated. But
it's complicated, but
it's something that should have been seriously looked at.
Well, and it's remarkable, now we're seeing, because of Freedom of Information Act, you're able to pull the data, but that data should have been disclosed, right? I mean, why are we having to fight with companies and organizations to reveal the data? Should that not be in the public domain?
Of course it should. Yeah, because the public's being given I mean, they should know what's in the vials. It's ludicrous to say this is, you can be injected and mandated even to be injected with something where they won't disclose what is in the actual vial because it's some intellectual property issue. You're sticking something in someone's body. They have a right to know what you're sticking in their body, and that's pretty basic. And they also have a right to know what the trials showed, and how the regulatory agencies could justify sitting on that is honestly, I mean, it's beyond me.
It's
unless
remarkable.
you assume that they're captured by the pharma themselves.
And I think that's the key point, is I feel like they have been captured, because why would you conceal these catastrophic results? Your test studies, the results have been catastrophic. According to the test results, Moderna and Pfizer, the vaccinated are more likely to die. Well, that doesn't take Einstein to say the vaccines are incurring damage, right?
Yeah.
So you halt the vaccines.
Marianne, I'm going to have to jump on another call.
Oh, okay.
Okay. No, but I can come. We'll have to cut it. I can come back if you'd like.
Okay. Well, let's do a quick part 2, because I want to talk to you a little bit more.
Okay. Up, yeah. So I'll be off for about half an hour. I'll come back to this link.
Okay. And we'll come right back on and just continue the conversation.
Okay.
Thank you. And we'll talk soon.
See you soon. Yeah. Bye.
So we're back. Thank you, David, for coming back to join us. So I think we were talking about a little bit of the shenanigans that seem to be going on with these very powerful parties that are creating the agenda for the WHO. Does this remind you of a drug cartel, or what in your mind is going on here with these powerful entities that are pushing an agenda with the WHO? What do you see this as?
Yeah, so trying to think where I read that recently, but someone put it as that very well. And yeah, they laid out the characteristics of a drug cartel. Firstly pushing a product with poor safety data, etc., concealing information, capturing the regulatory agencies involved, capturing politicians, and capturing the media as much as possible, and so on. And that is what it is, I guess, isn't it? If you see this as very wealthy corporations who are not abiding by an apparently very strong moral code, and haven't historically. I mean, it's there in history. The history of fraud around pharmaceuticals is public knowledge. It's not surprisingly few people know about it, but it's there in the criminal record. So it has all the ingredients of that. You have a group of people who are pushing a product on a population with a lack of honesty in order to make a profit, and managing a sort of, you could say, mafia-like or whatever you want to call it, but sort of managing the whole environment that a cartel would manage to ensure that happens. And they are using the instruments of there, such as the WHO and so on, public health instruments, in order to push their product. And
So can you give me a timeline of the decisions that are before us? Because I get a little bit confused. I hear about the IHR, I hear about the pandemic preparedness agenda and the treaty. What's coming down the pipe?
So the vote of the World Health Assembly, the countries, on the amendments to the IHR and on the treaty were both scheduled for May 2024, so in a year's time. That's the World Health Assembly, which is normally once a year. There are other things in the meantime that I mentioned the World Bank that already exists. WHO has at least 3 other sort of feet in the pan, or whatever you want to call it. So that there's other emergency. There's a sort of interim mechanism to try to put stuff in place, and there's this strange hurry with all this. If you consider COVID a pandemic, you can forget swine flu, so it's 3 in 100 years. There's this insane hurry to get something in place quickly, so they don't want to wait until the vote in May, and then there's a period of a year before they would actually come into force as far as the IHR amendments go, because there's a 10-month rejection period for countries and then 2 months to bring them in. They don't want to wait that long, so that they're already putting in place funding mechanisms and so on to build this bureaucracy and build this surveillance network. And you probably heard of a sort of the idea of an emergency corps sort of idea that has been in the media, and WHO wants to do that, to have this sort of mobile group that will rush around the world to emergencies. I mean, as if there are not already many NGOs that do this, bilateral agreements between governments that manage this, the MSFs of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just duplicating these mechanisms, but it is bringing it under the WHO umbrella. So they're acting, rather than just dealing with these health burdens that we talked about earlier, they're trying to put themselves in place as an emergency response group. And I mean, that is because they, with the surveillance, they will, people have found that emergencies are a good way of corralling people and making money. We have a climate emergency, we have a terrorism emergency, etc. The world now is all emergencies, and with emergencies you can subvert democracy, you can subvert the normal processes of law, and courts even will comply because they see it as an emergency. We've seen that in COVID. So you can get around the constitutional barriers to authoritarianism. through all these emergencies.
So what is the next emergency that you would predict? What do you think will be used?
There will be more viral emergencies, obviously. If you surveil for variants and you consider them a potential threat, and you could argue in some way everything is a potential threat, maybe infinitesimally small, but then we will have regional and global emergencies around viruses. If we can have a global emergency for monkeypox, we can have it for almost any virus that you can find. So we will keep having those, and the more we have, each time it'll be an incremental step further. Vaccine passports will be more and more enforced, especially for travel, etc. So you won't be able to travel without, being fully vaccinated, whatever definition someone has for fully vaccinated, etc. And most people, unfortunately, will comply with this because they do want to see their dying mother on the other side of the world, or they want to visit their children, or they want to go on a holiday. So, and as long as you can get most people towing the line, you can keep turning the screw more and more in this way. So I think that's what's going to happen, unless obviously it's somehow stopped.
What does that look like? How do we stop this?
There's various, this is where everyone speculates, isn't it? So, you can stop, I think you can stop it by people just refusing to be stupid and comply, but that takes time. So if you have mass non-compliance with frank stupidity, like, putting a mask on at the restaurant door and taking it off when you get to the table, or being injected with something for a virus that kills less than 1 people out of 1,000, and they're a completely different age group and morbidity to you, then it doesn't necessarily make sense you just refuse to be vaccinated. But you have to be prepared to lose your jobs initially for that, or not to go on holidays, etc. That's hard for a lot of people. But mass non-compliance gets a message to politicians. So then, politicians need to act on this. They're supposed to represent people and not be representing the people they run off to Davos every year to talk to. So, there are politicians out there who see a problem, but unfortunately, it's all sort of, certainly, in the US, it's all apparently one-sided politics, which is strange because this is a human right. Well, it's interesting. This is a human rights and bodily autonomy, etc. issue, but the people who call themselves left seem to be missing in action completely on this. Most of them. But this can clearly be stopped if politicians, if the US and a few other countries said they're not going to fund the WHO anymore, for instance, until it stops going down this path, then it would probably stop going down that path, because they do need the money. And if they purely living off pharma money and not major countries, then they will very rapidly lose what remains of their credibility. So politicians can stop it, but they have to see a problem in order to bother. And they have to be willing to risk their own next election, because pharmaceutical companies, etc., will be major sponsors of elections. So it is difficult, and they'll have to go through the media, which is, the New York Times it has the same major shareholders as Pfizer. It's no surprise that they have been rabidly pro big corporations and against bodily autonomy through the whole COVID vaccine thing. So the politicians would have to put up with the media saying that they're killing your grandma by not mandating everyone to have vaccinations, because that's what the media is paid to do by the largest advertisers, which are pharma. So it's difficult. The sort of hope, I guess, is that all these interests fall apart and start fighting each other, because they're brought together by pure greed mainly. And that's not it's a good basis for a short-term relationship, but probably not a good basis for a long-term one. So you hope that the infighting of those who are trying to wreck society for their own benefit will eventually pull it all down. But in the meantime, clearly people are becoming more impoverished. There's clearly issues in the financial world, etc., partly due to the printing of money and the strange sort of false way that economies were run during the COVID era. So it may well be that the world becomes so chaotic that it won't be possible to implement all the things they want anyway. But it's not a nice way to go, because I think, and people need to understand what is happening in other parts of the world. So, we are seeing unprecedented levels of increases in malnutrition, in acute food shortages, etc., in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And these are real things. They're not in the media, so because the media is not interested anymore in that sort of story, because then people might put two and two together perhaps. But these things are happening, they're just not talked about. But that doesn't mean, there's a growing migrant crisis in Europe. There's a reason for that. If you impoverish people en masse, then they will move to where they can get food and support their families. So it may be that the world becomes so chaotic because, we are being run by incompetence. They're greedy, but they're not competent. Diving into chaos is not a good way to stop something like this. It would be better if we had politicians who could stand up and just say, we have nation states for a reason. Mm-hmm. It's because in the end, you need to protect individual people. Individual people need to do that. You need to have a system where those in charge making the rules are directly responsible to those people. You can't do that on a global level. You can only do it within nation states.
Well, it seems as though the WHO and a lot of these other organizations are usurping nationalism and usurping sovereignty nationally, so the people within a country don't really have control anymore, nor do their elected leaders.
It seems that way. And it's funny because when someone says nationalist now or sovereignty, you start thinking far right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because we've been programmed, I think, in the media for the last 10 years to think those two go together. That if you're going to talk about human rights, the only way to do that is through representative systems, democratic systems. Yeah. And to do that, you have to have administrative boundaries within which, so that you can say, then the people here, this person is responsible to these people. They decide what this person, who is going to lead them for how long. And you have to have boundaries to do that. It doesn't mean you hate the people on the other side of the boundary or something like that. But, you have a boundary in a town so that you can have a council, you have et cetera. And in the end, if we're not going to be run by transnational corporations and their boardrooms, but we're going to be run by ourselves, then you have to have states within which to do that. And they have to have the power to stop corporations from doing what they want to do. Right. Otherwise, the corporations are in charge and not the people. So we've somehow given nationalism a bad name, but nationalism is just it's the people having their own government. It's the basis of human rights. Mm-hmm.
And I actually think nationalism right now is becoming in vogue for people who are aware of what's going on. I would have called myself a globalist, in the days that I used to read The Economist. I thought globalism was great. But actually, I reflect back and I think, no, nationalism is great. We can cooperate with other countries, but nationalism, I think, is very important. It's like a family. You need to have healthy countries for a healthy global economy. And
you need a community. And a community is not something on Facebook or Twitter. There's not a community, people sniping at each other. A community is where you dip in and help each other when you're in need, and you can only do that in person. And so yeah, you have to have a state to do that. Yeah, so yeah, I think, you know, we've been programmed to think, you know, anti-vaxxer, we've been programmed to think climate denier or something. We've been, you know, these stupid labels, which when you dig into them, they're just idiotic labels. Yeah, we've been programmed to think nationalism is far right. We've been programmed whatever, and so I think, you know, we almost need to deprogram ourselves. You know, why are so many people? You talk about why is, you know, how do we stop this? So all these people who are blindly following these corporations with these huge criminal records and fraud histories, as if they're the source of wisdom. And, you know, they wouldn't have in the past, but somehow we've been you know, reprogrammed to think these bad is good almost. So,
well, when you talk about being programmed, talk a little bit about the media. You mentioned that Pfizer owns the New York Times. What are some other links that you're aware of? Big links.
No, I didn't say Pfizer owns the New York Times.
Or not owns, but is a backer.
If you BlackRock, Vanguard, etc., the largest shareholders in both, and so, you know, and in CNN, Time Warner, and in Google, Facebook, etc. There's, you know, there are a few large financial institutions that have trillions of dollars that are the largest shareholders in a whole bunch of, you know, in the pharma area, in the media, in software, etc. And so, I mean, they have to run their business as effectively as possible, which means making as much money as possible for themselves and their shareholders. Logically, they should be using their media interests to maximize the profits of their pharma interests, for instance. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, yeah, you wouldn't, because there's ethical and moral issues, but if you can get around them, then you would do exactly what has just happened, and you would use those resources to buy up the regulatory agencies and buy up, you know, the international health agencies, etc. Because this is doing what you're supposed to do, which is maximizing the returns to your shareholders. But somehow the general population they've come to see anyone pointing out something obvious like that as a conspiracy theorist. And rather than thinking, yeah, that's pretty obvious actually, and so, yeah, we won't go to the CEO of Pfizer for our public health advice. We'll go somewhere else, or we won't go to whoever the CEO of Pfizer is sponsoring to give public health advice.
So why is that considered a conspiracy theory to say that media is owned by these large companies? It's in the open. It's very transparent.
Yeah.
This is no big secret. Why do you think it is that when you talk to someone about this, you're labeled?
I honestly think we have been somehow programmed. It may be inadvertent, it may be not, but you know, like you, I subscribe to The Economist, I subscribe to the New York Times. I subscribed to the New York Times because I wanted to support good journalism. At a time when it was under attack, I thought, you know, from 2016 onwards. So, but, you know, when COVID happened, it was very clear right at the beginning that the media was being used for propaganda. It wasn't reporting reality. So, sorry, repeat your question.
Oh, I guess I'm a little bit baffled that when I mentioned to someone I point out very concrete data that shows who owns the media, and yet right away this is dismissed as a conspiracy theory that the media is pushing their agenda.
Yeah, I think we have been programmed. So I think we've been, still for me, if someone says, oh, they're a conspiracy theorist, everything that person says is then colored in my mind. And I have to work really hard to think, yeah, it might be credible. I immediately tag it with, take this one with a grain of salt because it's a conspiracy theorist saying it. And, through COVID, I've found quite a few people that I thought were, have been labeled as conspiracy theorists. I've just written them off because the New York Times said they're conspiracy theorists. New York Times was one of my sources of truth and wisdom, therefore. So we've had this for 10 years. We've had, what is a anti-vaxxer? It is someone who, and even if you look at the dictionary definitions now, they basically say even someone who questions mass vaccination. I mean, why would you not question mass vaccination if you were vaccinating with a vaccine that hasn't been tested very well? People who are at minimal risk and are already immune to the disease. I mean, if that's anti-vaxxer, fine, we should all be anti-vaxxers. But all that is someone saying, let's bring a bit of common sense into this and look at the risks and benefits like we should with any medicine. And doing that is labeled as a huge negative. So to be a pro-vaxxer, the opposite, based on these definitions, you would have to be willing to do everything you're told by someone who is clearly gaining personally from this. The doctors in America, certainly some of the larger health insurance groups, they reimburse doctors on the basis of, have they got this percentage of people vaccinated or that percentage, etc. So the more people you get to take a vaccine, the higher income, not just because you get money for giving a vaccine, but you get a bonus because you've had X percentage of your patients vaccinated. So the whole thing is geared to maximize vaccine and to push the doctors to do this whether they like it or not. So, why would you trust the person who, their health advice from someone who is getting a bonus if you comply with what they're telling you? It's illogical. It's irrational to do that. But so we've been told by outlets that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies that such a person is a conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer. And so we're told to dismiss what they're saying rather than what the person who's sponsored for you to take the drug says. So we're all part of this. Some of us have noticed it, some people haven't in the last few years, but pretty well part of it. There's a few people who saw this long ago and wrote books and so on about it, but almost no one read them, and because they were labeled.
Well, you mentioned to me when you were a med student, they did a little experiment in your class. Do you want to share that with hypnosis? Because I found that fascinating.
Yeah. So, when we're doing psychology, we had a mass hypnosis session. And there's about 12 of us in the tutorial group. The psychologist, did the hypnosis, and I was sitting against the wall looking. Everyone else was hypnotized and they were doing what they were told to do. And I always felt completely normal. So I thought, there's something weird about me. And I've quite a few other people I know who immediately picked the propaganda and so on that was wrapped around COVID and saw something was wrong. They've had the same experience. They're not susceptible to hypnosis. So I think we are, we're all wired differently in our brains, partly the early, experiences in early childhood, partly probably genetics, etc. And, the human should be, because if you're going to survive as a species, you need a diversity of responses. So you might have the weirdos who are weirdos most of the time, but when the population's in a crisis, those weirdos are the ones that get them out of it. So you need a few of them in the population. It's well established that a certain percentage of the population are difficult to hypnotize, probably is more resistant to propaganda, etc. And they may normally be the outliers that, seen as a bit of a problem. But I think in COVID, it's, people like that have been much less taken in. And so it's not, you're not smarter or anything like that. I think you just your thought processes work in a different way.
Well, in my observation, in second and third world countries, people rely more on intuition than I don't want to say ego, but it almost feels as though in these countries, they have a sense, maybe they have a stronger survival sense. What do you think is going on? Because you look at Africa, where the uptake of the vaccine has only been apparently 4% across the continent. And in a lot of the developing countries, they're saying, no, thank you. Why do you think this?
Yeah, I mean, I think in parts of Africa it's been higher, but yeah, it's been very low, and it's not a problem of not being able to get the vaccines there. Vaccines have been expiring because people don't want them. Yeah, maybe people, it's interesting. I mean, maybe social media and so on in the West has been a problem. Maybe people are out of touch with reality. People in a lot of cultures other than Western culture, they have very different ideas of death and spirituality, and from that, what is important in life and what is not. We've seen this, people, absolutely terrified of death in the West. And of course, it's understandable, but life cannot be a process of doing everything you can to avoid death, because there's not much of a life if you do that. So, and if you in Western countries, there's been a big drop in the number of people believing in an afterlife, or believing in a higher spiritual power. So, if you think that you're just a lump of organic material that happened to be slapped together for a few decades, and then you just rotten to dust and that's it, and then death is the end of everything, and that would be pretty scary. So I probably, and in other cultures, there's a much stronger sense that there is something else other than just the organic part of a human. So I think that may have something to do with it. Actually, but also, but also, a lot of these countries, like sub-Saharan African countries, it's not long since they were under colonialism, and they've seen big countries and big companies ripping them off and destroying their cultures and destroying their livelihoods, etc., to extract resources from them. So it's in recent memory. So they can also, I think, see the patterns of what's happening now, which to me is very much the same.
Well, as well, from what I understand, in Africa and maybe parts of India, so I think it might have been in Kenya and in parts of India, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was lacing vaccines with sterility drugs. So there was a massive case. I believe it was about 1 million women in Kenya who apparently
I don't think it's a Gates Foundation. I think I'm not.
Is it Gavi or?
I think it was WHO.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it is a real case. It's interesting, and people should look this up, because I was in WHO for years and I would never have believed this. If someone told you, heard rumors and thought it was rubbish, no one would do that. And it doesn't mean WHO wanted to do this as an institution, but it was done by people connected with the organization, and it's a real thing. And it was uncovered because 2 doctors in Kenya at a Catholic hospital got suspicious and looked at the constituents in the lab and showed what was in it. That was quite remarkable. It may be an outlier. It's not the only case like that. There's a couple of other cases. It shows, they're outliers, but it shows that there are people out there who would do this. That it isn't a conspiracy theory that someone might want to do that at scale, because it has actually been done. It doesn't mean it's a policy of these organizations, but it means that, it's like, Nazi Germany did things. We're not seeing a lot of those things now, but we're seeing early stages of what happened in the 1930s in Germany with the push to get the population to exclude certain people and denigrate certain people because of they are unhealthy and a threat, etc. It's the same sort of messaging that the Nazis used early on. So, we need to take notice of those things. That it doesn't mean that's the aim with the current vaccines, but it means that that is where things can very easily go and have gone even recently.
Well, what part is instilling fear in all of this? Because it does seem as though fear is a fabulous way to control people.
Yeah.
And do you think that fear has been a big part of this? And who has been?
Obviously, yeah.
But knowingly, who do you think has crafted this idea of let's scare the population and force them into lockdowns, force them into vaccines, injections? What do you think is going on here?
So I think it's pretty well documented. This is behavioral psychology. This is what behavioral psychology is for. And most Western governments, for instance, now have behavioral psychology units attached to their cabinets and so on. The UK one is SPI-B, called SPI-B, etc. And this is public. And people on SAGE in the UK, the committee that ran the COVID thing, that they have said that they deliberately use fear, instilled fear, to get people to comply. I've been involved in the past in projects where, in public health, there's this idea that the most important thing is to get the right behavior rather than for people to understand why they're doing it. So if you think the best way to stop someone from getting malaria is to sleep under a bed net, you can tell them to sleep under a bed net on false premises. And as long as they end up sleeping under it and end up dying less from malaria, it's a good thing. That's the thinking. I'm not comfortable with that. I think lying to people in the long term is a problem. But you can see why people buy into that. So it doesn't mean they're instilling fear because they hate people and they want to hurt people. But they can honestly think, because they've been taken in by the whole story, that there's an existential crisis with this virus. And if everyone doesn't lock down and put on a mask and all these silly things, then they will die, or lots of people will die. So we'll instill fear in a false way so that they will comply and will be saving their lives. I think a lot of people think that way. And there were workshops and so on before COVID where behavioral psychologists sat around and worked out how to do this messaging for a pandemic. So it's very much planned. It doesn't mean it was of evil intent. I think it's intrinsically evil because it's based on lying to people in order to get them to do something that they would not necessarily otherwise do, rather than giving them a choice to make, an informed choice to do what they want to do. But I can see how people can, in their minds, justify it to themselves.
Well, it's fascinating that people will look at the labels of food that they consume, but they will go to get the vaccine. And if they were to ask the pharmacist and say, can I please see the insert? There was no insert. Well, the insert was blank. What did you think of that? A blank insert. They actually put a blank, intent, and it said intentionally blank. And from what I understand, did all the pharmaceutical companies, did Pfizer, Moderna?
Yeah, I don't know.
Did they all do that?
I don't know. When I first saw that, I thought it was false, but then I realized that it wasn't always false. So this actually happened. Yeah. I don't know whether I'm not sure whether under an EUA you just don't need to give that or something. If they've given those trials results that we showed with the TGA, that there's a double the rate of early pregnancy loss in rats and
so
much higher fetal abnormalities, I guess people wouldn't want to take the vaccine. So they obviously did it because they wanted to sell the vaccine, but it's not informed. And most doctors who gave the vaccine would be completely unaware as well. They just think that the authorities would do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. So they would do what they're told.
Yeah, it's fascinating that the whole concept of informed consent has escaped the world here.
Yeah,
Okay, how can you have informed consent if it's a big mystery as to what's in the vial?
yeah, of course you can't.
What
And
what do you think was in the vial? What do you think is in the vial?
some mRNA in lipid nanoparticles that have PEG and some other ingredients which Pfizer says were not independently tested for toxicity, etc. So they say that in the disclosure to the regulatory disclosure. There's probably I mean there's some excipients and so on to preserve that, some preservatives I expect. I don't think there's any, I find it very difficult to believe that anyone would put something in deliberately to harm people. I don't think that's credible. But there has been a lot of vaccine produced very quickly, which suggests that the normal quality controls were probably not in place. And there is, people have looked at lot variation, shown that it's very high, that there's a lot of fragmented RNA, that there is some residual DNA from the expression process, etc., in there. So, I think probably there may be a lack of quality control compared to normal medicines. I don't think that, to me, the worry is it's mRNA, and the way that mRNA works is it gets into your cells and tells your body that that cell is foreign and needs to be killed. That's how it works. It's the principle. So that's intrinsically dangerous for fetuses, intrinsically dangerous if it's getting into the ovaries, etc. So that's more than enough to get worried about it.
And does it ever stop producing spike protein? I mean, you were saying earlier that the spike proteins are showing to be in very high concentration in ovaries and testes, in the brain.
The lipid nanoparticles are in high concentrations there. The lipid nanoparticles carry the RNA, which produces the spike protein. So you can assume that the spike protein is, but they didn't actually test for that. They didn't test with actual mRNA to see where the spike protein was being produced. It's an obvious thing to do, and they didn't. They looked at where it would be taken, which is in the lipid nanoparticles, and then they stopped. So, it's
messenger RNA, it's never been used on humans before.
It's never been used.
It was only used on ferrets, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's used in animal studies, and there was problems with toxicity, etc. So, yeah.
Didn't all the ferrets die? From what I understood, it caused the ferrets to die, and I thought, that doesn't sound good.
I don't know, then you have to look at the doses. You have to look at if there's something specific about ferrets. So animal studies can be a poor proxy for humans, but they put up red flags that tell you to look very carefully. Yeah.
So what countries are resisting and what countries are signing on quite happily to this new, these new requirements with the WHO and the pandemic treaty?
I'm not sure any countries are really resisting that. There are some, the original amendments are put up by the US in 2022. Only one of them got through, which, essentially just shortened the time, the rejection, that you could reject the next round of amendments. But others are rejected, but I'm not sure that is because countries were standing up, for freedom. There's a lot of money involved in this, and everyone wants a share of the pie. So I think that's probably part of it. There are individual politicians and groups of politicians who are standing up against it and speaking. You see them speaking to almost empty chambers in Western parliaments because all the others are so brainwashed or so cowardly that they can't even sit there and listen and have a rational conversation about this. So, maybe they want to be re-elected and they think they need money to do that. I don't know. So I don't think that it's hard, maybe we'll see some countries stand up. And I think in general, population-wise, you mentioned, for instance, African populations. So populations with a history of colonialism and sort of tyranny are more likely to recognize what's going on. Eastern European countries have had a much lower vaccination rate. And, the Eastern Europeans I know in the US were very quick. They lived under communist regimes, authoritarian regimes. They were very quick to pick up the messaging early on in COVID, that the patterns, the fear-mongering and so on, the sort of patterns of propaganda. So I think there are populations that are more resistant and more likely to stand up.
So you'd mentioned earlier infighting. Do you sense, because I'm sensing in the financial world, there might be some infighting with the Bank of International Settlements and the large banks, because essentially the banks are putting themselves out of business if they go with central bank digital currency. Do you see any infighting occurring within the pharmaceutical world?
There's some arguments over patents at the moment. So, they're arguing over the pie around the mRNA vaccines. So, one company suing another, etc., on infringement of intellectual property. But it seems a bit of a sideshow. They're only doing because they're all after the pie. They're not arguing over whether there should be a pie.
Now, what about, there seem to be a lot of warnings right now that we talked about this earlier, but there's going to be a future pandemic. We're on the cusp of another pandemic. We may need to enter another lockdown, a new vaccine. I think the H1N1, they've even rolled out a new vaccine in preparation. Is it H1N1? I'm hearing rumblings that there's another pandemic, which makes me think, well, how do they know? If it hasn't happened yet, how do they know? But what do you think is going to happen here? How do you see this?
There's a bird flu around, avian flu, influenza at the moment in the world. So it's in wild bird populations and some domestic bird populations. There's been about probably 3 human deaths, I think, CDC. There's 6, but CDC thinks probably 3 of them are misattributed. So there's probably been 3 human deaths in the whole world. So we're on the cusp of another pandemic, but the previous proper one was 1968, so about 50 years before COVID. So if we had 50 years and then we had COVID, which killed people an average age of about 80, and we're on the cusp, and we never had lockdowns before, so why are we going to another lockdown? I mean, lockdowns have obviously been a disaster. Look at the economy. It wasn't COVID, it was lockdowns. So you wouldn't, even if you had another pandemic, you wouldn't do that again if you were sane and rational. And money was not your object. Either we will have another pandemic because someone will modify a virus and release it, or because they will fashion a pandemic out of a minor threat that we would normally have just gone along with and not noticed. And that's pretty easy to do, clearly. It looks like a lot of the COVID deaths were misattributed and were at least partly due to poor treatment, especially early on. So it's not hard to get the numbers up. If you pay hospitals, if you pay families more, if it was a COVID death than a death from something else, then you'll find that COVID deaths go up, and people, that's how the money went in the US, for instance.
And Canada as well. In Canada as well, they incentivized it that if you labeled a death as a COVID death, you received a sizable sum of money. So people would come in with from a car accident and die. They test them with the PCR test, and they had COVID, and they chart it as a COVID death. Well, the person clearly died of a motorcycle accident or a suicide, or, you know, it
Yeah.
went on and on. So when they've done audits, they've discovered that very few COVID deaths were actually due to COVID, whatever that is.
Yeah, primarily due to COVID. Yeah, but if if you're the family and they're offering you $9,000 or whatever, it's hard not to take it. And if you're the doctor and you're writing a death certificate, and writing that word will give them give the grieving family $9,000. Refusing to write it will have them saying you've just stolen $9,000 from us. Then there's a lot of pressure to put "and COVID" on the death certificate as well.
Yeah.
So this is just human nature. It's not, but yeah, why would you ever do that? Why would you give the hospital so much money as they did for admitting a patient with a diagnosis of COVID versus something else, adding remdesivir, putting them in ICU, more money, intubating them, more money? Why would you do that when these are for-profit businesses that their main role is to make money?
It makes no sense.
It's extraordinary.
Why
It makes no
would
sense.
It makes no
Yeah.
sense. Why would you incentivize one type of death over another? And
Yes.
then when you share this with someone, they go, "That's conspiracy." Well,
Yeah,
it
but
isn't
it's-
conspiracy because it's in the hospital records how much they're receiving from
Yes.
COVID deaths. And
It's a policy. It's
a policy.
government
that-
policy. Yeah.
So can we briefly touch on PCR tests? I'm sure you know the history with Christian, Jostin, or no, Peter Jostin, Dr. Jostin.
Christian Jostin. Yeah.
Christian Jostin. So that test was authorized within 24 hours. And that one single test was used to, diagnose 8 billion people.
No, it wasn't. No,
But
that was
the
initially.
PCR, the PCR test, tell me about that.
The
what you
PCR
know.
in general, yeah. So the original PCR test had 2 primers. You normally have 3, which the more primers, the more specific it is. And there were some issues with the initial one, and CDC had one that didn't work very well. So in the very early months of the COVID event, let's call it, there were issues probably with the accuracy of the PCR tests. But later on, after some months, companies, large diagnostic companies made their own tests, and that they were well tested. They test them against the other types of coronavirus. They test them. So they were quite, in good hands. They were very specific to SARS-CoV-2. So the problem wasn't the PCR test. PCR tests are an extremely useful tool, a brilliant invention that has helped medicine a lot. What it tells you is that there's genetic material of a specific type in a sample. It doesn't tell you the person has active virus. It doesn't tell you the person has a disease from that virus. So normally, with a few exceptions, like if someone's HIV positive, they may not be sick, but you say, okay, they have the HIV virus. But generally, PCR is, you use that in conjunction with a clinical picture.
Exactly.
So
I think
if you
the
fall off a
presentation.
motorbike, you have a positive PCR test, you haven't got COVID, you have a positive PCR test after falling off a motorbike. But if you've lost your sense of smell, you have a bad cough, you have a fever, your O2 sats are dropped, you've got unusual chest X-ray, and you have a positive PCR, then it's highly likely you have COVID.
Right. But if you're asymptomatic,
then you haven't got COVID, because
but-
COVID's a disease. If you're asymptomatic, you haven't got a disease.
Yes, but the PCR was used to designate that you have COVID, even though you don't show any symptoms. You have COVID.
Yes,
You have a positive
and-
PCR.
Yeah, and the problem with PCR, so firstly, it can pick up genetic material residual after the infection is gone. So you could be positive for a month or more after COVID's got better. And it doesn't mean you're going to infect anyone, but you can pick up some residual genetic material. Another problem is that you get cross-contamination. So if you're not very, very careful in the lab, then you have one positive sample and 10 negative samples. And it takes a tiny bit of PCR. So you end up, some material from the positive sample contaminates the negative ones. And suddenly you've got 11 positives when you actually only had one. And this was, the BBC showed this was a big issue in the UK because they were running PCR labs, which if anyone has done PCR knows you have to be extremely methodical and careful and extremely careful about cross-contamination. There's samples going everywhere and vials breaking and all the rest of it. So you know that they're going to have a lot of false positives. The other issue is that normally you cycle, and each time you cycle, you double the number of genetic material. Normally about 30 cycles, 32 max is where you would go and you'd say, okay, there's a significant amount of material there, it may be an infection. But they were cycling up in a lot of places up to 40 or so. And you know when you're doing a PCR that when you're getting up to that range, there's tiny bits of genetic material and you're increasing the initially low chance of having a false positive result as well. So they were running far more cycles than you normally would with PCR, and then they were misusing the result as a disease rather than as one of a number of factors that would lead you to a diagnosis.
Well, I know the late Kary Mullis, who won a Nobel Prize, spoke quite a bit about the PCR test, and he was quite cynical with it. He said, you can find something in anything, so it's not a particularly good diagnostic tool,
no,
but somehow Christian Drosten managed to make this the gold standard for diagnosing.
It's a good diagnostic tool if it's used properly, which means not too many cycles. And Kary Mullis, when he was talking about, you can keep cycling and you'll find something everywhere. So, but if you use it in a rational way, in context, and you put the result in context, and you're very meticulous in the lab and so on, then and you've shown beforehand that it is highly specific to that particular sequence, then it can be a reliable guide that there is that particular genome in a sample.
But how does the PCR, didn't the CDC or the WHO come out at some point? I thought it was December 2021, and they said actually the PCR can't delineate between COVID and the flu. So they were going to halt the use of the PCR, but somehow the PCR lived on.
No, I don't think they said. I would have to see that. Most of the tests on the market do delineate between SARS-CoV-2 and the flu. So as long as you don't, cycle it too long that you end up.
But where did the flu go then? During COVID, what happened to the flu? Where do you think it
fascinating.
went?
I don't know.
Do you think it disappeared? Or do you think it was or do you think it was relabeled?
No, I don't think it was relabeled, because I think there's good surveillance across most nations for flu, and lots of people can test for it. So I can't see how the whole world can not find something that is there, because not everyone is, on board with whatever. So,
but everyone who was sick was definitely labeled as COVID. It didn't matter what you had. You had COVID.
No, but they were testing for flu, and flu became very rare. It may be that it was outcompeted, but viruses interact with each other, so it may be that SARS-CoV-2 outcompeted. I don't know. That's not my field. But
it's not.
But I do think surveillance for flu did go on, and I do think flu did become very unusual.
Yeah,
it's fascinating why.
Fascinating. So if you're going to predict the next emergency, you think it might be a virus? Could it be climate change? What do you think? I'm betting.
It's already an emergency, we're told. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So, by a lot of measurements, there is still Arctic ice in summer, and polar bears, you mentioned earlier, have actually increased, and the temperature has not increased exponentially. It's been relatively stable overall globally since 2016. It was increasing before that. There was a warm period in the Middle Ages, warmer than now. There's a warm period in the Roman period where they're growing vineyards in southern England. There's, the glaciers were melting in Alaska near Juneau, and because it was getting warmer the last decade or so, and they were finding tree trunks underneath them from a few thousand years ago, which means it was even warmer a few thousand years ago. So the climate is changing.
Climate changes, yes, that's a given.
Yeah, and because the climate has always changed.
Mhm.
And there may be an anthropogenic part to it. It's why not? But and it's interesting because so we're told that climate change is bad. Human history is the history of climate change. Climate has always changed through human history. That's what climate does. CO2 has increased. You know this, and plant growth has increased 30 or 40%. Because CO2 has increased.
That's
because,
right. Plants love CO2.
Yes, if you want to
Yes.
grow a good greenhouse commercially, you pump in CO2. So one of the reasons we can probably feed 8 billion people is because crop growth has increased with rising CO2. So it doesn't mean CO2 is a good thing rising, but it means it's not all a bad thing either. But if you say that, and all we've just talked about is fact, you're a climate denier and etc. I mean, this is just fact. So what we're losing with climate, with COVID, and everything else, is the ability to have rational discussions about complicated subjects.
Yeah.
Which we need to do if we're going to manage them. So, having minimal pollution is sort of common sense, but impoverishing most of humanity in order to achieve something which is at least to a very large part a natural phenomenon, undoubtedly, is also an irrational thing to do.
Well, you probably know this. I remember I was fascinated. I read this report that warmer climates are better in terms of survival rates than cooler. Like as the world, if we have extraordinarily cold times, more people tend to die than due to heat.
No, true. Yeah.
Which is interesting. That never gets talked about in the media, but I found that a very interesting fun fact.
Yeah, there's a fascinating letter that the medical journals, and the medical journals are businesses like the media. There's a letter, I think it's 77 or 70 something medical journals put out, I think it's last year, about climate, saying there's a climate emergency, etc., etc. And they one of the things in that letter, it said, so, the BMJ and Lancet and so on ran this. One of the illustrations was people over 65 years are dying more in the last 20 or 30 years, I can't remember the number of years, of heat, as an example of how terrible this was. So, they didn't mention, one, most of that increase is due to the increase in the number of people over 65 in the world. There are far more over 65s in the world now than there used to be. And that is most of the increase. They also didn't mention far, far, far more over 65-year-olds have died of cold in that period. Hypothermia is a much bigger killer than hyperthermia. And so it was a fascinating illustration, because this is most of the medical journals. And they would not approve a paper unless it was about COVID. They would not normally have approved a medical paper that had such a fallacy in it. But they put this out as their own letter. So, I mean, everyone seems to be caught up in this whole idea that you've got to be hysterical rather than sit down and have a rational debate.
Well, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, what are your thoughts with these journals?
Well, they're businesses. In the end, primarily they're for-profit businesses. They may have started differently, but they are. They're not independent. They're owned by large media houses and so on. So they're one organ of a media house that owns, lots of journals and lots of other things. And is there for profit. You go back further, they're owned by Vanguard and BlackRock and State Street.
The medical journals are actually owned by these groups too.
Yes, some of them, if you go back, yes. They're owned by larger media conglomerates that are owned by, etc.
Yeah. All roads seem to lead to BlackRock.
All roads lead there. Yeah,
it's quite remarkable.
It is remarkable.
I wish ChatGPT was still in its original form that it was a few weeks ago, because you could go on and find out just about everything. But I understand they're now censoring it. You cannot
down.
source the same information, but it would have been fascinating to ask some very pointed questions to ChatGPT.
Yeah,
It was
who
quite
owns what?
revealing.
Yeah.
Who?
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, the who owns what is easy. It's more like who's behind the veil. You know, we talk about well, I'm not reading The Economist anymore because I discovered that the Rothschilds bought a half stake in it a few years back. Well, you know, all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, I've been reading The Economist for 35 years. But I don't really want to be reading a Rothschild publication right now. But I would love to know who's behind the veil. Who do you think is behind the veil? ChatGPT could have helped us with this one before, but I don't think it will help us now.
Yeah. I don't, like you, I can only say what other people suggest.
Rockefellers, well, certainly in the medical industry, the Rockefellers hijacked the whole medical world, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is where it stops being helpful when you start putting names on this.
Yeah, well, that's right.
You know,
it doesn't really matter.
There has always been people throughout human history who, you know, it's human nature that if you have an opportunity, you abuse others for your own benefit. That unfortunately, that's human nature. Some people overcome it, a lot of people don't. So, yeah, what we have to do is not recognize this person did this or this person's doing that, but recognize that this is what human nature does. And so we have to build institutions that withstand that and cannot be corrupted by it. And because if you decide this person or that person is the problem now, and I'm sure it's a lot of people, it's not one or two, but and it may be countries as well as in, corporations, but you decide these people, you shift them aside, someone else will step into the hole straight away.
Yeah.
So, there's a problem of inequality of wealth, which allows this to happen. So nefarious people aren't a huge problem if they're not hideously rich, so that they can buy up everyone else. If they become hideously rich, then it becomes a problem that's almost impossible to deal with because they buy the media, they buy the politicians, etc. And then how on earth do you manage that? So I think, like building a WHO that absolutely can't take private money. And you have to accept, okay, it'll have a bit less money, but fine. I mean, someone else will step in maybe, but it'll have a bit less money, but it won't be mass vaccinating people who are already immune and are intrinsically so young that they're not in any significant danger from a virus that affects old people, and that have far higher health problems that this mass vaccination campaign is diverting resources from. You wouldn't do that. You would find out what their problems are and help them to address those problems. So that's a much better model, even if you got less money, than spending huge amounts of money on stuff which people don't want and don't need from a health point of view, just to fulfill the whims of your sponsors. So we need to rethink the whole conflict of interest thing, which has been broken down over the last 20 or 30 years in a lot of Western countries. I know I'm from Australia, it's been broken down there. There used to be laws that one person could only own a very small part of the media. And they were progressively broken down with pressure from media magnates who sponsored politicians. So now you have these monopolies in the media, etc. And so I think we need to rebuild. We need to look at what these underlying problems are, not the individuals.
So
rebuild it so these individuals can't do the harm.
So I think that's a brilliant idea. Do not permit private or corporate donors to an organization that is meant to be looking after the world as a whole and their health. It's a distorted, it's a massive conflict of interest. Do you have any other ideas of how we can upright this sinking ship? It feels it's quite dark, right? Well, go back. Let's go back. I'd love to hear what you say. What other ideas do you have to correct this problem?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? Because you're speaking to people probably who already see what's going on. We have to stop complying with stupid dictates, but that is it's easier for some people than others. And I know people who haven't complied have lost their jobs, lost their homes, and so on. I think being more politically active is important. Speaking out, I mean, that's probably the best thing you can do. So lies become accepted as truth because no one keeps contradicting them. And there's famous quotes from Goebbels and so on about this. So we've seen incessant lies, over the last 3 years. They've just been repeated and repeated and repeated in medical journals, in newspapers, etc., as if they were accepted fact. You pull them apart; they're not accepted fact. I mean, take pandemics are becoming more frequent, more severe. I mean, it's false, absolutely false. But that statement is repeated over and over again in the media, over and over again in medical journals. It's a complete falsehood, provably false. But if everyone is not, every time they see it, they don't say this is garbage, this is false, and call it out. So then people, those who don't know better will accept it as fact, and then they will do what they would not otherwise have done on the basis of this lie. So I think the best thing that we can all do is just keep calling out when we see lies and falsehoods.
Yeah. Be brave,
being weaponized.
Be bold, be outspoken. I find, though, there's not much, it's hard to get, not an audience, but it's hard to even engage with people. Like I'll say to people who are completely now caught up in this climate lie, I will say, listen, I know as a fact that billionaires are buying record amount of waterfront property, oceanfront property. If there truly is global warming and they're worried about rising sea level, why do you think the billionaires are buying waterfront? And people won't engage. Now, normally this would, elicit an interesting conversation, but you just get a blank stare. So I find it very difficult to, do you find it difficult? Like, tell me, I mean, with your colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, why are they using corporate, why do you get, hundreds of corporate jets private jets flying to climate meetings, of course they're not taking it seriously. It doesn't mean there's not some truth, a kernel of truth in this, as there's a kernel of truth in COVID, but it is clearly being blown out of proportion and used for profit by nefarious people who want to, want the population to be confused and scared.
Yeah. And why did all those the Davos crowd want all their pilots to be unvaccinated? And why did they ask all of their drivers to drive petrol cars? They weren't allowed to use electric cars because in Switzerland in the winter, the electric cars didn't work very well. So they weren't supposed to use them. So the hypocrisy, the hypocrisy, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
And so you talk to people about this, that would normally elicit, some questions of, oh my gosh, really? But it doesn't seem to trigger anything. People seem so asleep. And I guess we're circling back to, why are some people not paying attention to the blatant hypocrisy?
There is a behavioral psychology operation. It's not a conspiracy theory to say that it is there it's an official thing of governments and so on, and of corporations. So behavioral psychology works. So a lot of people are confused. Okay, just talking, mate.
You know what? We'll wrap it up really quickly here. But go ahead.
Sorry, where were we? So behavioral psychology works, and people are generally confused, and there's so much information coming. They're bombarded by lies, and then someone who they've been told is a conspiracy theorist tells the truth. do I believe these 10 media outlets, or do I believe this one person who's labeled a conspiracy theorist? So it's really hard if it's not your field. You know, I was fortunate in COVID that it's my field, you know, this sort of thing. So I could see the issues, but yeah. So I think that is why, you know, people who do see it have to keep talking, because you have to give, you know, people are not stupid, but they are, behavioral psychology just work, and they are confused. And they need to hear the other side all the time. Even if you think you're not getting anywhere, you probably are. You know, you're at least stopping them from going deeper. And if you can get them to question, so it doesn't help to tell people blah, 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 but it helps to get them to ask questions. You know, why are these rich people buying waterfront properties, rather than saying they are buying, but, you know, why do you think they are? Why get them to start questioning in their minds, and then that will lead them hopefully in a more useful direction.
So when I think of the perfect WHO, the WHO would be focused on malaria, starvation, TB, malnutrition, child labor. Those are, you know, that's the type of WHO that I would be happy to see my country donating to, you know, supporting an organization like that. That's the old WHO.
Yeah, and one that was governed by the people, governed by the countries and the populations who were, and that only responded to requests and was constitutionally unable to tell people what to do.
Yeah. So do you think it's possible to reform the WHO back to its origins, or do you think that we need to create a new organization? Is the current WHO too corrupted? Is there any hope for it?
It would have to be a huge change, wouldn't it? I don't know. It's a hard one. You know, should any international institution survive more than 50 years, say maximum 2 generations? Because human institutions always do this. Yeah, you let in a bit of money because, you know, in private-public partnership, because you need some money for this, and then it's always a slippery slope. So maybe you need to just restart institutions every 30, 40 years and just have a use-by date. And, you know, you have to, the WHO is there for 40 years, year 35, we start a new organization, new people, and then we transition some of the programs over and start again with new people who aren't sort of, you know, it's the other thing with these institutions, once you've been there for 10 or 15, 20 years, your role becomes to defend the institution, not to carry the institution's original mandate. And you see that with the Catholic Church, for instance, and you know, the problems they've had with child abuse and so on. And, you know, they're covered up because you're trying to save the institution rather than saving the child. So any human institution, I think, is in danger of doing that. So maybe you just need a use-by date on any institution, assuming that, you know, just assume that they will become corrupted eventually.
And are there any organizations currently that you do really respect that could slip into that role?
I think the WHO, you need a new one, because it needs to be representative of countries directly, and needs to be only funded by countries. And there isn't really another organization that fits that. You know, the WHO is there for a purpose.
It's very specific, and it's a very important purpose. But the fact that they're trying to steal our sovereignty away with these insane demands that sound like are on the, you know, coming about very quickly, it's quite a scary entity. It almost rings true of, you know, the UN and kind of world, you know, world. Yeah,
well, to me, the scariness is beyond them. Yeah, the scariness is the way they're being used to me. I'm not scared of the WHO. I'm scared. You know, I worry about the forces that are using it.
Yeah. And the UN, do you worry about the UN and?
Or I think it's in bed with the same people now, isn't it? I mean, it's not hidden. You know, they have large partnerships with, you know, the World Economic Forum and so on. You know, why is a a nation-based organization that is there just for nations. Why are they partnering with these huge non-state private actors? It's not what they, immediately they're going to start representing interests that are not the interests of the populations. So it's the same thing. I think that maybe they're all passing the use by date, and we just need to reinvent.
Well, the onset of central bank digital currencies, ironically, is kind of ties into this. Are you worried about that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes like that. There's a good Monty Python song. I'm so worried about the luggage retrieval system they have at Heathrow. Yeah, you can worry about everything. Yeah, but yeah, I am worried about central bank digital currencies because, as the Bank of International Settlements you mentioned, as their head has specifically said, and Christine Lagarde has specifically said as well, the advantage of it is that you can use the money to control what people spend. So the whole idea of it is that the money isn't real. It's not your money that you can put in your pocket and spend when you like. It's money that is always owned by the bank, and they give you the chance to spend some of it on their behalf on things that they agree you're allowed to spend it on. So that's what central bank digital currency is. So that is it's a great idea in a totalitarian dictatorship. And it's a non-starter, you would think, in a constitutional democracy where the basis of the whole state is the individual and the individual's sovereignty as a human being.
It kind of comes back to the fascism, global fascism. It's worrisome. So do you think that COVID was rolled out as a means to an end, and the end game is central bank digital currency? Do you think there's any link? Because the lockdowns certainly helped.
I don't know if COVID was rolled out. I think, the lab leak theory seems to be the most credible theory. It was certainly weaponized once it was out. And, if you've got enough labs doing gain of function research around the world, it's not surprising that you can sort of predict that it's going to break out somewhere. So people were sort of ready to take advantage of a mild viral outbreak, and that's what happened. It's clearly, the push for vaccine passports and so on, when they clearly serve no purpose. I mean, you're going from a country with an endemic virus to a country with the same endemic virus. So what? Why do you need a vaccine passport for that? So, this is, I think, part of getting people used to being controlled and showing their papers whenever they do things.
So it's not for health. It's not for health purposes. It's more about control.
Yeah, if you were in Australia, you had to show a QR code to go to shops and things. I mean, extraordinary. This is a country
same in Canada. Same in Canada.
Yeah, and a few years ago in Australia, they tried, it was the 80s, they tried to bring in a digital ID, national ID, and the people said, no way. And so it never happened. So now they bring it in through COVID and no one blinks. And you're showing, you even need it to go and buy petrol, at a gas station, to buy groceries in the store. It's extraordinary what happened, and people accepted it. So it's a small step from there. I think the hard work has been done, and it's now a very small step to get the central bank digital currency. But I think that's going to be extremely hard to undo. It's a disaster for democracy.
Do you think it's going to happen?
We are told it will, by the large banks. I hope not. I hope that the only way that can stop, I think, is if enough politicians just say absolutely not, which they should. That's their job, but we'll see if that happens. It's not going to happen in Europe. I can see it conceivable in the US.
I think it's very conceivable. In Canada, they're talking about bringing it out in short order. One of the first banks to roll out the digital identity in a hard fashion is the Toronto Dominion Bank, TD Bank. And in Canada, they have given people, I think, I can't remember, it's maybe in May, you will not be able to use your online banking or your bank card if you don't adopt their digital ID, which is kind of tied in with biometrics. So now, oddly, TD Bank is the most shorted company in the history of time right now. So obviously, a lot of pundits are thinking this bank is about to collapse, but they're trying it. They're going for the jugular, and I'm sure all the other banks are following suit. But central bank digital currency, at least in our country, the open banking platform has been established across the whole country. And that is set up for central bank digital currency. They all are on the same platform. So it's very ominous. Again, people don't understand the magnitude of this. This will put us in the same position as in China. Mass surveillance, and you're controlled by your money.
Yes, absolutely.
So
and if you support the wrong political party, or you don't get, the right vaccine or something that, the government thinks that week you should have, then you go to the grocery store and you try to pay for them and you can't.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's not making up. That is exactly what, the Bank of International Settlements and so on is saying is the advantage of having this system.
Exactly.
And we saw that in Canada, didn't we, with the truckers?
Anyone that donated to the truckers convoy was considered a terrorist.
Yeah.
And a good many had their bank accounts frozen.
And most people go along with it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, unless the public do wake up, most people go along with it because terrorists are bad. And it's too burdensome to think, is that person really a terrorist? So it is quite concerning.
Well, we have a bill that's about to pass in Canada called Bill C-11, which essentially defines you as a danger and a terrorist. You can be imprisoned for up to 8 years, or fined $1 million if you criticize the government, or if you criticize any public. You're not allowed to disagree with the government. They're going to start monitoring your social media. We're going into, a surveillance state, and it all started with the lockdowns.
Yeah, that was, I think the ideas obviously started before, but the lockdowns were they were the key to get it going.
It's quite, so I keep thinking, okay, our original conversation is about the WHO and how do we proceed? And I keep thinking, oh, can you imagine if the WHO right now was paying attention to Ed Dowd's data? I mean, he's a former BlackRock guy. He's got great data coming out on excess deaths with vaccinated people.
And disability,
Yes, and disability, that's right. And you would think the WHO would be on that quickly and go, oh my gosh, we have a crisis here. We have 4 billion vaccinated people in the world, and we have excess death in horrific numbers in our working population, the 25 to 49-year-olds. That, to me, that's a real crisis that the WHO doesn't seem to be paying attention to.
We have a reduction in birth rate that starts 9 months after mass vaccination started, and there's
so these are the real crises. That's right. But interestingly, the WHO's not very interested in this.
Yeah, or almost no one is. The media certainly isn't.
No, why? That to me should be front page news.
I agree. This should be, whatever the cause, and we can surmise, and there's obvious candidates. You normally look for what has changed during that period, what exposure is new, and mass vaccination is obviously one, the most obvious exposure.
Well, they're certainly trying to, every time I open a paper, I see a new excuse. It might that you made your bed too fast, or you had too much.
And maybe that's true, but maybe we were all making our beds too fast. But then you do studies to look at all these.
Yes, exactly.
Beds too fast, climate change, mass vaccination, all these things, and you can look at the associations, and you can figure out well, yeah, it actually was people who made the bed too fast who were dying, and there you've solved the problem. You tell people not to make their bed so fast. So, yeah, but the problem is that is not even being looked at. There is an increase in newborn mortality in Scotland, and they deliberately did not include COVID vaccination in the study because they were worried that might make people think that there's a problem with the COVID vaccine. That is the antithesis of how you go about doing a serious public health study. But
it's tragic, it's a heartbreaking time to be alive, witnessing it. It's like watching a slow motion train wreck, and I just keep thinking, at what point will enough people, like you say, resist? We need to have a massive non-compliance, but in Canada I'm not seeing it.
So the US is interesting. I think it can happen in the US. I'm from Australia originally, and I haven't been back there for a while, but most people in Australia in the polls and so on seem to think that everything was fine and they were just saved from the existential crisis. Like the absolute disaster, which apparently we had in the US, even though hospital occupancy was lower during the last 3 years in the US than it is normally. But
same in Canada. Our hospitals were empty during COVID, but that's not what the media said. But anyone anyone during the pandemic that went to hospitals said the hospitals were empty. And my doctor friends in ER and things like that said they couldn't get shifts because there was no work. And that's during the height of the COVID pandemic. Well,
and then there were periods where people had COVID in large numbers, like you have flu in large numbers at certain times.
Waves, yes.
But if you look at the overall what went on, it's so. But in Australia, I know people who said they can't let their hospitals become fall apart like they did in the US. But it didn't happen in the US. Even Andrew Cuomo in New York said that New York hospitals were never overwhelmed. So, and that was the worst place in the US. So, but the US is interesting because it is so divided as a country now. And, that used to be, to me, a tragedy. But now I see it as a strength because it is very difficult to get the whole country to agree to work under a totalitarian leader. Whereas, because there's states, but there's also, it's not, there's certain state leaders who have stood out, but there's also just the individual, and it varies state by state. Where I am now, there's a very strong feeling that the individual is the key figure in everything, and the government has to be resisted in terms of overreach on so on. In Australia, it's very different. The government's the nanny who will look after you.
It's the same in Canada.
So,
any of the Commonwealth countries, I think, are hooped because that's the same mindset in Canada. People trust the government. People trust the government in Canada, whereas in the US, people are a little bit more feisty and a little bit more spirit. So I think the future for the US is more bright than.
I do.
I think the countries that I'm worried about are Germany, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Those are the countries.
I think a lot of Europe, I think the EU, maybe Eastern Europe will survive, but
Eastern Europe
is in a really bad way.
But the country that's really showing to have good spirit is France right now. They're really rising up. The people,
we'll see.
They like a revolution, and maybe that's what's needed. I don't know, but so what keeps you awake at night? I'll make this my last question to you. What
I don't,
when you lie awake at night, or is it you're is it just
I sleep quite well actually.
You do sleep well. Oh, so you don't lie awake at night fretting about this?
No, I don't.
Well, that's good. What's your secret? You don't feel overwhelmed with this?
No, I mean, sometimes I do during the day. Sometimes it gets me down, but I don't know. I mean, I moved to Texas, and we have a few acres and we have animals and birds, and the people around here, life is completely normal, and there are circuses and there are school concerts and rodeos and whatever. So, and people look normal. They smile. You can see them faces. It's not, and the attitude of people is what we were talking about. That a lot of people, they see that something is wrong here, and they cannot articulate it very well, but they recognize that something is wrong, and they have an attitude of not doing whatever they're told just because they're told to do it. And I think that helps. So I used to be in Washington State, where the mindset is quite different, certainly around Seattle. So it's I sort of, I don't know. In the end, the sun comes up every day. And the world has been through nasty times before, and I think things will get really bad. I think in low-income countries, and perhaps even here, lots of people will die unnecessarily, unfortunately, and there'll be a lot of chaos and crime and migration, as we're seeing now in different parts of the world. So I think it'll be a disaster in a lot of ways, but because of the way the world is going. But I mean, humans will still be human, and there are good things about that. So, and I have beliefs that I don't believe I'm just a lump of biology that will disappear when my heart stops beating. So, I think there's more to humans than that. So I think in the end, there's a lot of empty people who are extremely greedy and have become extremely powerful, who are doing nasty things to the world, but they're not going to win in the end.
I agree.
In the end, because everything's based on lies, and you can't win in the end if you base everything on lies.
So do you sound almost spiritual. Do you see this as a spiritual battle between good and evil, or how do you see this chapter of life right now?
I think it is. But I don't think it helps in a lot of ways to talk about that. I mean, I do see it as a spiritual battle, but I have a view of the world that, I have a spiritual view of the world. But I know a lot of people who don't share my view, and, religious view and so on, but who also are standing up and so on. So, I think evil is a real thing. I'm not sure people are evil. I think people do evil and are led to do evil. So I think even the worst, the people driving the worst of this are not irredeemable. And that's another reason why, targeting individuals rather than the problem is not the way to go.
It reminds me of Romeo Dallaire, his book, Shake Hands with the Devil. And he said, during that genocide in Rwanda, he was looking at the devil square in the face. I mean, the evil. And it reminds me right now, it feels like we're in that same place where the extent of evil that we are witnessing, I've never witnessed in my life. This is no.
Same here. I agree. And I think this is probably one reason why people don't want to face it as well, because if you actually sit down and think through exactly what is happening, it is pretty dark. And
sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. And I sometimes envy the people who are in their little bubble, because I think, imagine being in a place where you don't think anything's wrong.
The problem is that in the end it'll come for them.
Oh, absolutely. No, I agree. I agree.
And, you know, as I say, you know, I'd rather die standing up than, you know, or than just sort of wither away and, you know, be clobbered lying in a ditch. because
Well,
someone told me to.
you, Dr. David Bell, you will be on the right side of history. Absolutely. You're speaking out. You come from, you know, a background of being immersed in a lot of these industries. You have a very deep understanding of it. So I'm just grateful that you spent the time chatting with me today. This has been very, very enlightening conversation. And
No, thanks, Marianne.
no,
I think
really,
I mean,
I appreciate it.
people like you are actually serving a really important role because we don't hear rational conversation. I hope this is rational, but we don't hear rational conversation much in the main media, and it's you know, the growth of alternative outlets. And that's one of the hopes as well. We were talking about how things can get better. I mean, people like you actually getting the word out so that people can hear alternate viewpoints.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your history. Very, very valuable information that you've shared here. So thanks again.
Thanks,
and
Marianne.
maybe we should do an update. You could let me know when it's good, because I think things are coming down the pipe with the WHO so fast right now that maybe we should stay in touch. And
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll let you go.
Thanks.